For the past 2 weeks, our country has stood up and spoken up about the death of George Floyd and so many other Black Americans at the hands of the police there to protect us. Right now, parents are having conversations that no mother or father should have to have with their kids, warning them about racism and police brutality, but also teaching them about civil disobedience and their rights, encouraging them to fight for a better future. These are tough talks for adults, let alone little ones, but they are important conversations that we all need to be having right now. MSNBC correspondent Trymaine Lee is joining me now. He is also the host of the NBC News podcast, Into America. And Trymaine, you are tackling this very issue in your latest podcast. What are parents telling you about how they are approaching these issues and bringing up these conversations with their kids?
That's right, Allison. These are very tough times, and parents some are doing the best that they can. And so it's not just about teaching children about hate and racism and police brutality. We have the other side with many white parents who never actually address the idea of race at all. And so those white children end up being lawyers and police. And if they don't teach them to respect other people, then society will teach them how to respond to other people. And so it's a big question where you have two sides of it. Where you have to say something, though. I've been talking to experts and researchers who say, you know what, the best thing is to get in there early, be open and honest, but you have to teach those values very young, because as we know, the basic roots of America were founded on racism, and many of those threads remain today, Allison.
Yeah, so Trymaine, that's the tough thing for a lot of parents, right? Trying to figure out when is the right time to have this kind of a talk, to have difficult talks with their kids. What have you learned about why it is so important to have these conversations early and when maybe the appropriate time might be?
You know, for this week's Into America podcast, I spoke to Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, and she says you have to start young, because if you allow that space, again, it will be filled with something. So she says it's best to get in there when they're young, be plain, be open, be honest, and also give them age-appropriate information that starts as early as 4, 5, and 6. But let's take a listen to what she had to say.
It's important to say children notice racial differences. They notice those differences. They have questions about it. And it's not a bad thing to respond to those questions in a very matter-of-fact way, because people come in different colors. Just like they have different hair colors, sometimes they have different skin color. It doesn't have to be a heavy-duty conversation. And there are lots of wonderful books that are appropriate to be read with 2- and 3-year-olds, picture books and, stories that illustrate children of different backgrounds playing together or talking about, hair texture or skin color or, questions that children have that are appropriate for their developmental level.
As Dr. Tatum said, these kids are going to get informed by the world, whether you have any input or not. So it makes sense to get in there, have these conversations that are age appropriate, but you have to begin young. There's no right way to do it, but you have to at least try.
And Trymaine, she brings up such a great point, right, about kids noticing things so young. I mean, we have all been out with young children who just will point and ask a question about why does that person look different from me, or why is this person doing this? Kids are observant. They are wise. They see and know things. And it's such a great advice that you got to meet them where they are. You can't just wait for someone else to fill that void, to answer those questions if you're not doing it yourself as a parent.
That's right. And obviously children will notice those differences. But the thing is, we will tell the children what those differences mean. It means that we are diverse, and we have a rich culture in America with different people. Because if not, we know what America will do. It's your skin or your hair may mean something else to someone else. And so it's important that they will notice those differences. It's up to us to reinforce that with our values, that people are equal and should be treated as such.
Absolutely.
Because if you don't, bad things can happen, and we see it play out every day.
Trymaine, we have seen some parents bringing their kids to these protests and to marches, and some of them have turned violent. What impact can that have on kids? And for parents who might be frightened to bring their kids along or not sure if it's a good idea to bring their kids along, is there some wisdom or advice here?
Well, certainly, it depends family to family. You know, there are some families who are so service and community oriented that they will gladly take their children to a march or a protest because it's also part of an education. You know, there is probably nothing more American than protest. The roots of this country were founded on protest. But again, you know your family. Obviously, parents want to look out for the well-being of their children. So if it's going to be a dangerous situation, you might not want to take your children to a nighttime protest or uprising. But again, it's also part of exercising as an American your First Amendment rights. And so there are a few things to better educate your children on the First Amendment than allowing them and helping them to exercise them.
We have seen images of so many amazing young people, Trymaine, speaking up, speaking out, sharing their voices. Trymaine, I can't thank you enough. You have been on with us throughout the week, whether it was your special earlier this week, your podcast, just helping us to have the conversations that a lot of Americans are having for the very first time, and they're important conversations to have. So thank you so much for helping to guide us through this. You've really been incredible.
Thank you very much, Allison. I really appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.